So let's talk about sort of growing up, Doug Ulman, Maryland, the community you grew up in, and because that ultimately influenced sort of a lot of what you chose to do as an adult and how you think about the world, really.
Yeah, so I was fortunate to grow up in the first planned city in America. So it's called Columbia, Maryland, and it's right between Baltimore and Washington. And it was developed by a guy named Jim Rouse, who was a visionary real estate developer in Baltimore. And he bought thousands of acres over 10 or 15 or 20 years of farmland. And he said, I'm going to create a city from scratch that is built on the values of diversity and community and inclusion. And
what was the time frame that this was going on?
Yeah, so Columbia is now almost 60 years old.
Okay.
So
he's very ahead of his time.
Yeah, very ahead of his time and very much just post-civil rights sort of era. And people thought he was too out there. He hired, as an example, he hired a lot of sociologists, and he said, here's what I want to do, help me design this. And they said, we can't. It's not possible. And so he just kept hiring until he found people that were willing to take on his vision. And so my parents had both grown up in Baltimore, and they met when they were in D.C. in college and law school. And when they decided to settle down and have a family, they were one of the first 100 or so families to buy a house in Columbia. So that's where I grew up. And as a kid, you just think where you grow up is normal. So I didn't realize till later in life when I went to college that it was probably a little bit abnormal. And I also didn't realize how much influence growing up there had on the rest of my life.
Yeah. And when you think about sort of growing up in that environment, and then you obviously went to college and you got a little bit of an awakening that wasn't what the rest of America looked like. What do you think, like, how would you describe that difference to people?
I think the biggest difference was that there were things that were very much normal and natural in the environment that I grew up in that weren't in most places. So an example would be that every neighborhood that he built, he wanted to make sure that it was diverse. So there were apartments, there were townhouses, and there were single family homes. Every neighborhood had a community center that had a pool and a gas station and a convenience store and at that time a Blockbuster or a grocery store or whatever. And so the idea was that everybody congregated there. So you just constantly bumped into people and you were surrounded by the people that were in the neighborhood. It was not segregated at all by race or by socioeconomic status. And so it was just very diverse, both racially, religiously, and any other sort of by any other metric. And so, that when I got to college, I realized that most people came from an environment where they were surrounded by people like themselves. And that's not good or bad, but I had the privilege of going to college with two of my very closest friends from growing up. And I always say both of them are Black. We all three are different religions, and we all grew up going to public school together.
Right.
And so that was not normal when we got to college,
Yeah.
that we had sort of grown up together.
Yeah. And sports played a big role in sort of your upbringing and sort of athletic endeavors, and ultimately led to college pursuits as well. And soccer, primarily your sport. Did you play other sports besides soccer? Or did you focus solely on soccer?
I played basketball in the winter, and as a kid, early on, I played some other sports, but soccer quickly became the focus. And in fact, interestingly, the city of Columbia was and continues to be known for soccer.
Really?
For some reason. In fact, it was when I was a kid, it was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. There was a player by the name of Todd Haskins who was the best player in the country. And in that article about him, it said, Columbia is the hotbed of American soccer. And so it was just sort of, I don't know how that came to be, but...
You think that any of that has anything to do with the planned community component of it, the sort of mixing of all of these different, the melting pot per se of...
Could be. I haven't thought about it too much, to be honest, but ironically, and you've gotten to know Dante Washington, who's a dear friend here in Columbus who played for the Crew and for the national team, et cetera. He and I grew up together, and he was, my coach growing up and counselor at soccer camp. And, so like there was this group of people that we grew up wanting to emulate. And so it's ironic now that we live in Columbus and that he's such a big Pelotonia supporter and obviously community leader.
Yeah. So you ended up going away to college. You went to Brown University, and played soccer there. And how'd you choose Brown? Why'd you choose Brown? Was it the soccer program? Was it, obviously the academics are superior? And what ended up making you choose there?
Yeah. So a couple interesting twists of irony, maybe. So when I was looking at colleges, I remember my dad and my mom saying to me one night, you should go to college wherever you will feel the best and the most comfortable if you break your leg and never play soccer again. That was their whole mantra. It was like, go to the place where you are going to excel outside of soccer.
Don't make it a soccer decision.
Yeah. And so essentially what they were saying is like, go to the best possible school and use soccer to get there.
Yeah.
In a way. Little did they know I would be diagnosed with cancer and soccer would become less important just literally a year later. But the irony of going to Brown was that there was a young, dynamic, impressive college soccer coach who was coaching at the University of New Hampshire. And he was probably at that time, 30 years old. And
so young in the world
of
head coaches.
Totally. And he flew down to have dinner at our house. And he had just taken the University of New Hampshire to the NCAA tournament 2 years in a row. They'd won their league. Nobody ever sort of thought of UNH as a big soccer school, as a big hockey school and lacrosse. And he flew to our house and we were having dinner. And I remember my dad said to him, how long are you going to be there? Like, you've had all this success. You're young. Like, you're probably on to the next thing soon. And he looked at my dad and he said, the chances of me being at New Hampshire for all 4 years of your son's sort of experience are very slim. Like, he was super honest about it. And a month later, after I had visited UNH for a visit, I had visited Brown, I had visited other places. A month later, he called me and he said, I just got hired as the coach at Brown. And he said, you have 2 weeks to let me know if you're in. And it was just an amazing sort of twist of fate that I wanted to play for him and I wanted to go to Brown.
You were being recruited by Brown to play soccer. Okay.
Correct. And it just worked out perfectly.
So what was it? I don't really know, and I don't know that a lot of people know what that college recruitment experience is like, but did you think about the coach or the school more as you made that decision, knowing your parents had encouraged you to really think about the institution and sort of everything beyond soccer, but to have met him as the coach of New Hampshire and then being asked to play for him as the coach at Brown, is that a big deal? Maybe not. I mean,
I think, the opportunity to go to a school like Brown for me was something that would not have been in the cards otherwise necessarily. And so that was appealing. And I think the coach has a big role in the decision process. I mean, you want to go to a place where you feel comfortable that they're a good person, that they're a good leader, that they're going to look out for you. And so I think that was important. I think, again, in hindsight, starting at Brown the same year he started at Brown was helpful.
You're both new.
You're both new, you're figuring it out. And again, he continues to be a friend, and what we sort of experienced together a year later, we never could have imagined. But I think the decision is both the school and in a lot of instances the coach.
Yeah. So let's fast forward to that year and how your, the start of your cancer journey ultimately started to unfold.
Yeah. So interestingly, I had a very humbling experience my freshman year of college because I was not good enough to play a lot in soccer.
Which was different than high school.
I mean, completely different. I'd never not played, and so you get to college and you realize you're playing with people 3 and 4 years older than you, who are stronger than you, they're faster than you, they have more experience than you. And so it was humbling. And so when I left for the summer after my freshman year, the goal was to train all summer to be able to play. And so that's what I did. And I was in the best shape of my life and ended up going on a run with my brother one night. I had already worked out all day and and he was sort of home visiting. He was working in politics at the time, so he was home at my parents' house for the week. And so we went for a run, and I got back and I was wheezing. And I had had asthma as a child, but I hadn't had an issue in a long time. And after about 2 hours, my parents said, you should go to the emergency room. And I thought, I don't need to go to the emergency room. I'm fine. I'm healthy. I'm fit. And finally, about an hour later, we went. It was like probably 11 o'clock at night. And the doctor on call said, you're fine. It's just allergies, humidity. It's just something in the air. And he said, you'll be fine in the morning. And as we were leaving, he said, but before you leave, let's do a chest x-ray. And so they did the x-ray. He looked at it and he said, no problem. So I went home, and the next morning I woke up and I was completely fine. And I was coaching at a soccer camp, and I went to camp. It was like 9 to 2 or something. And again, no issues. At 2 o'clock came home, and there was a light on our answering machine that was blinking. And the message was from our family doctor, like our general practitioner.
Yeah, not the person you had seen at the emergency room.
And he said, the hospital notified me that you were in last night because I'm listed as your doctor in your record. And I was at the hospital visiting another patient, so I looked at your chest x-ray, and there's something, you need to have a scan immediately. And again, this is 1996, so the technology was different, the quality of the x-ray was different, and what he saw was a shadow on the x-ray behind my heart. And he thought I had a massive heart condition. So I had a scan that afternoon, and all I remember was that there was a glass window in the corner of the room, and as I was sliding out of the sort of CT machine, my mom was standing over the technician's shoulder, and the technician was pointing at the screen.
Yeah, pointing at something.
And I was like, first of all, how did my mom get back there? That is not normal. She's an advocate, so I'm sure she
talked her way back.
Yeah. And why are they pointing at the screen? If it was normal, they wouldn't be pointing. And so it turned out that they found this mass that was growing behind my heart in my rib cage. And
it's like on your back.
Yeah, it was on the inside of my ribs.
Inside your ribs.
On my back, like on the upper left side of my back. And so, but at the time they kept calling it a growth. They didn't say it was a tumor. They didn't say it was cancer. They actually said the chances of this being cancer are 2%, because it's not why you were wheezing the night before. It's not pushing on your lung yet. It's not causing any other massive problem. And the reason you discovered it was because you came into the hospital and had an x-ray. Otherwise, you would not have found this until it probably was a problem. So at that stage, it wasn't cancer. It wasn't likely to be cancer. And the doctor said, I was supposed to go back to school a week later for preseason soccer. And he said, you should go back and you should play. And when you come home for winter break, we'll take it out. Because he thought, there's no problem.
Yeah,
it hasn't bothered you before. It's probably slow growing. It's been there for a while, and don't worry about it. And it sounded good, but at the same time, I got home and I was like, that doesn't sound right. I don't know that I can live normally thinking that there's something inside. And so anyway, I had surgery a week later. They took out part of my rib cage that was attached to the tumor. And it was a bizarre experience. I mean, I'd never been in a hospital. I'd never stayed over in a hospital. I never
been under for a surgery or anything like that.
I mean, never signed consent forms that listed every single possible potential side effect. And it was just a weird experience because I felt totally healthy, and yet they were telling me they needed to do all these things surgically, but I didn't feel sick.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it was kind of hard.
That was similar to, as we've talked about, my experience where I had no pain, I had no other health issues, and you're being told you have cancer and you're having surgery, and you actually feel worse coming out of the surgery.
Totally.
Because your body just went through the trauma of surgery than you did going into it. And it's hard to reconcile.
Absolutely. And I think I took for granted at that time that I had just trained all summer. Like after being humbled the year before and worked so hard, and then to have it sort of taken away in that moment was challenging.
So you have surgery, and then as anyone who's been through any semblance of a similar experience, the waiting game of a pathology report and all of that stuff. They've got to send it away, and so you're looking at your clock for days on end and sometimes weeks on end until you get that report. At that point, after the surgery, did they give you any indication that it would be a better than 2% chance of cancer?
So what happened was, just as you said, I came out of surgery and they said it will take 5 to 7 days for the pathologist to do an analysis. And so then, you get to day 5 and you're like, did they call? Nope. Day 6? Nope. Day 7? Nope. Day 8. So then we started calling and started hearing things like, oh, it was inconclusive. We need to send it to some experts in other cities. So then it's like, okay, well, where are you sending it? We're sending it to the Mayo Clinic. We're sending it to, the National Cancer Institute. We're sending it to Georgetown. And that process just took forever. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there's one story I remember where my mom called both the hospital where I had the surgery and the institution that was getting the pathology slides, which happened to be 45 minutes away. And after 2 days, what we found was the slides hadn't been sent. They were sitting on a desk of someone who hadn't FedExed them to the place.
Oh,
and so my mom drove down there, picked them up, and drove them to the other hospital. It was literally like 45 minutes away just to try to expedite the process. And so it was just a frustrating waiting game. And as every day went by, you think it's going to be bad news, because if it were normal, they'd have already told you.
Give you a quick no and you'd be on your way.
Right.
So eventually you get the diagnosis, and so you were diagnosed with not a very common form of cancer.
Right. Yeah, I mean, essentially it was probably 2 to 3 weeks. It was almost 3 weeks after the surgery. And it was the day before I was scheduled to go back to college.
Oh, wow.
And my parents and I drove to this appointment in Baltimore, and the appointment was scheduled to be a post-operative clearance to go back to school.
So it was scheduled before.
Correct.
Yeah.
But the goal of that visit with the physician was he's going to tell you whether you can go back to school tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And when we walked in and sat down, and we had developed what I would describe as a contentious relationship with this doctor for reasons that I can get into. But we sat down and he opened what looked like a massive medical textbook. And he said, well, it's been confirmed you have chondrosarcoma. And he started pointing to this graphic and description in this medical textbook of what it was. And so as much as I think subconsciously I thought that was what we were going to hear, or that we were going to hear it was cancer, I didn't expect to hear it that day. And I wasn't prepared to hear it at that moment, because I was excited to go back to school. So it just threw us for a tailspin, and it was just a bizarre meeting. The doctor ended up staying for about 5 minutes and then saying that he had to go to another surgery, and introduced us to another doctor who would explain the rest of it, who we'd never met before. So the doctor who we had a difficult relationship with walks out after telling us the news, and this other guy comes in.
You have cancer, see ya.
Yeah, this other guy, really nice guy, but he's walking into this weird dynamic. It was strange, and it was just strange.
So did you end up? Did you go back to school the next day or no?
I did.
You did?
Yeah, we drove to Rhode Island, and to come full circle, when I got back to Rhode Island, the soccer team had already started practicing, and I went in to meet with my coach, and we had this long conversation, and he said, I want you to speak to the team this afternoon. So the team had no idea. They knew I'd had surgery, but they didn't know anything was going on. And
the coach did.
The coach knew. Yeah, the coach knew. Yeah. And so that afternoon after practice, I spoke to the team, and then worked with the coach on a series of goals for getting back in shape and trying to get back to play soccer, which he really forced me to do.
Such as like fitness type goals. Did you notice a very fast decrease in the fitness you had built up over the summer just by going through the surgery?
Yeah, not only the fitness, Joe, but I couldn't walk standing straight up. like, I mean, I had to walk with my hands on my hips, like pushing
Yeah.
my body because
You're missing part of your rib cage.
missing rib cage. And the biggest impact was that they cut through all of your muscles in your abdomen. So you can't, like when you laugh, it's painful. You can't laugh.
That was
you
the same
can't,
thing
you know,
I went through,
yeah.
right? Like coughing, you know, all that
Exactly.
stuff.
So like just breathing was hard. Like, so not only being out of shape, but you just felt like you couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
But essentially I asked my coach sat me down and said, when are you going to play again? And I was like, Mike, you're crazy. Like, I'm not playing this season. And he was like, no. He's like, you're going to jog in 4 weeks, and in 6 weeks, you're going to scrimmage, and in 8 weeks, you're going to, and I thought he was crazy. And he said to me, I'll never forget, he said, you're going to put on your uniform every day for practice, and you're going to come to practice every day. And you just watch and maybe walk around the field or just be there. And it was hard, but psychologically, it was the best thing ever, because otherwise I would have sat in my dorm room and just
What was the biggest
depressed.
lesson sort of you took from that?
I think the lesson was, if you set goals that seem unachievable, you will go so much further in life.
Yeah.
Because I ended up playing soccer on the, in the stadium at Brown in October of that year, which was crazy.
Yeah.
And the next day I woke up and I called my coach and I said, I'm done for the year. I had exhausted every ounce of energy to get back, and like I was done.
Yeah.
And he was like, no problem. But he was like, you did it. My parents were there. It was great. It was amazing. But had he not pushed me to set a goal that I thought was crazy, I never would have gotten there.
Yeah. So this was fall sophomore year.
Yep.
And what transpired sort of post you playing this game, you sort of hang up your cleats, so to speak, for at least the rest of the year. What did you then do with that experience? I mean, just knowing you, and everybody I think at this point knows you didn't sort of leave your cancer experience behind and go do other things. And so, like, what sort of series of events did that kick off for you or motivate you to go pursue?
I think the journey of being diagnosed and then, going for second opinions to all these places and just sort of searching, coupled with the experience of having an unbelievable family and friends and teammates, I think led me to believe that there was one aspect of my life that was missing, which was I couldn't find other young adults with cancer to talk to. And I think I just wanted to have that experience. And so when soccer started to become less of a time commitment or less important mentally, I was looking for something to fill that gap. And at that same moment, I started to call around and ask other organizations, what do you offer for young adults? And most of them said, well, we don't. They said, literally, one of them, a big organization, which I will not name, said, we don't offer services for young adults because people your age don't get cancer.
And this is a cancer organization.
A very large cancer organization. And that just didn't sit well. And so I just decided that we should do something about it. We should start an organization to help other young adults. And I was entirely naive, didn't know what it would be or how it would work, and just started talking to people about it and asking for help. And everybody wanted to help. And that, just started a journey in the nonprofit cancer community.
Yep. So your chondrosarcoma was sort of your first bout with hearing the words cancer, but it wasn't your last. And so, and I think if I remember correctly, it happened pretty quickly, sort of soon thereafter you had sort of another diagnosis. And walk us through that. And you sort of went the peaks and valleys of the valley of hearing you had cancer to the peak of playing in that soccer game again, and sort of all the way back down.
Yeah. So when I went home for winter break after that fall, our family decided to start, what at that time was called the Ulman Cancer Fund for Young Adults, and it consumed every hour, meeting with people and lawyers and people who knew fundraising and family friends. And then I went back to school in the spring and came home for spring break. And when I was home for spring break, I went in for a full checkup. And I was at Johns Hopkins at the time. And the dermatologist said, we're going to remove some moles from your body. And which was not abnormal. And I forgot about it. And I went back to school the next week, and we had spring soccer practice. And in the spring, if you're not in season, then your practices are usually at night or super early in the morning, because the fields are being used by lacrosse and other people and whatever. And so we had a 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock practice that night. And just as I was walking out of my dorm room to head over to practice, the phone rings, and it's my dermatologist from Johns Hopkins. And she says, "I've got some news for you." She says, "The spot we took off of your chest is melanoma." And I was shocked because I had forgotten about it. Like, I was back to sort of semi-normal life. And I also, like, again, realized how naive I was, because I had learned everything there was to learn about chondrosarcoma. And now I hear this word melanoma, and I'm like, I have no idea. Yep. Does that work the same? Is it different? How does it, all this stuff. And so I remember walking to practice that night, and my two closest friends, Kumi and Chris, I had to tell them, like, right before practice, like in the locker room, like, "Hey guys, I just got this call." And then I had to tell my coach, and then it's just like, it was just deja vu all over again. And so that was the second diagnosis. And then a few months later, in early June of that year, I was diagnosed again with a separate melanoma diagnosis, this time more invasive. And so it's, it was a long 10 months.
Yeah. Yeah. So that winter, you and your family had started the Ulman sort of, what was it? The Ulman Fund for Young Adults. How long did that take to get sort of up and running to where it was public, and knowing this was not to date it too much, but it was pre the boom of the internet, or maybe it was during sort of the boom of the internet.
There was Lycos and Alta Vista.
But what were you starting to do? Like, did you just start by doing a small event, and then do a second, slightly bigger event? And
totally, we did exactly what every other family does, and so many people associated with Pelotonia do. Yeah, you start an event, and we did a dinner. The dinner was actually the first dinner and auction. Was essentially a week after my third diagnosis. Was planned for like a week after. And it was your traditional thing. You ask everybody to donate auction items. You invite people to buy tickets or tables or sponsor. And, we raised, I don't remember the exact number, but $30,000, $40,000, $50,000.
A lot of money.
And thought, this is incredible. Like, we have everything we need now to run these programs. So that was the first event. And then the second event was we decided to have a college soccer all-star game. So we invited all of the best players from around the country, and we got sponsors, and we brought them all to Maryland, and we had a game. And it was incredible because there were so many friends and sort of people had grown up with each other, and they all flew in and trained for a few days. We got college coaches to come coach them. We got waivers from the NCAA to allow them to do all this. And it was fun. I mean, the first game was at a local high school, and there were a couple thousand people, the stands were packed,
Any notable players?
Oh, we had tons of players. We had, Ben Olsen, who played for the national team and was the coach of DC United for years, played. Josh Wolf, the coach of Austin, I don't think played, but he was going to play one year. Lots of people in the MLS played.
That's cool.
Lots of Olympians. It was awesome. It was fun. Yeah. It was a lot of fun.
So you were diagnosed with cancer 3 times in a 10-month span. And so, each time, the first time, each day you were getting farther and farther away from the diagnosis, and then you got diagnosed a second time and then a subsequent time. And sort of what was that like? And have you ever had sort of the finality of feeling like you're truly past it? Or does it hang with you a little bit sort of every day and knowing that, you didn't just have it once, you didn't just have it twice, this came back 3 times. And what's that like for you?
For me, unfortunately, the way that melanoma works is when you've had one episode, you're more likely to have a second. And when you've had a second, you're more likely to have a third. And so I live with that, but I think because of the work that we do, I don't dwell on it. until I have my 6-month checkup. And then a week before, I start to get nervous, to the point where my wife can say, do you have a checkup next week? Because she can sense that I'm acting differently. And so it definitely weighs on me. The sarcoma, while it was a 2% chance that it was malignant, it's way less than that it ever comes back. And so I don't think about that at all. And I think that has some finality, knock on wood. But the melanoma, unfortunately, and I don't say this as a pessimist because I'm not, I probably will have another melanoma at some point. But that's why I get screened all the time. And that's why I go every 6 months. And that's not without nerves, for sure. And I think that's normal. Years ago, we did lots of research. And if you ask patients and survivors, what are the 2 hardest phases of the journey? What they will repeatedly and overwhelmingly say is that the number 1 hardest phase is from diagnosis to the start of treatment. Because you're searching for second opinions, you're searching for answers, there's why me, you're going through this whole roller coaster. Once you start treatment, you feel like I've got a plan, I've got a team, I know what we're doing, I'm hopeful it's going to work. And the second most challenging time is from the point when they say, you're good, go enjoy the rest of your life.
Evidence of disease.
Right. And then they say, go back to your normal life. And you're like, but my life is not normal anymore.
Yep.
Like it's changed. And so it's that period before or post-diagnosis, before treatment, and then post-treatment where there's still unknowns. And I think most survivors, and I'm included, like you live with that for a long time and maybe even forever.
Yep.
There's a line we used to use all the time that said, cancer may leave your body, but it never leaves your life. And it's sort of always a part of who you are going forward.
During your time at Brown, this is one of those, I either call it a Columbus story or it's a Doug Ulman story, but one of the founders of Pelotonia, and Gordon Gee, happened to be the president. Was it the president position or a similar position at Brown, right? And you developed a relationship with him then. Yeah,
Gordon is and continues to be remarkable and a huge influence on my life. The funny story, quickly, is that there's only one building, or historically, there was only one building on campus at Brown that every student had to go to, and that was the cafeteria. So at Brown,
central cafeteria.
Yeah, there were multiple, but you had to be on the meal plan for 3 years. So you had to live on campus for 3 years, and you had to be on the meal plan for 3 years. So you didn't have to go to the library, but you had to go to eat.
Yeah.
And at that time, the only building on campus that allowed smoking was the cafeteria. And so after I was diagnosed, I sent a letter to the person who was the president of Brown at the time. And I said, I find this really confusing that the only place I have to go to eat is the place where, like, it was like an old airplane where they're like, this row is smoking and this row is not smoking. And there's like no divider or anything. Yeah. And the response I got back was, well, we have a lot of international students. And I'm like, okay, well, you can't smoke in the classroom. You can't smoke in the, whatever. So long story short, less than a year later, Gordon Gee gets hired as the president of Brown. And his office reaches out to me and says, we found your letter in a file. The president would like to meet with you. I mean, they kept the file somewhere. I don't know. So I go into his office and he's like, this is ridiculous. Like, we shouldn't allow smoking in the cafeteria. He said, I just wanted to tell you that. And so, and his first wife had died of cancer a few years earlier. Okay. And his daughter, at the time, was a few years older than I was. But she was living with him at the time. And anyway, so we just struck up this great relationship. And he actually, when we started the Ulman Cancer Fund, he joined the board. Wow. And he was on the initial board. And he continues to be a great friend.
That's cool.
And the full circle is that my wife makes granola for her fundraising for Pelotonia. And Gordon Gee is a granola aficionado. Oh, and he is now ordering it all the time from her in return for Pelotonia donations.
That's funny.
So she ships him granola all the time.
One of the things we didn't touch on about going to Brown is, I remember asking you this when we sat down at some point over the years, but what did you think you were going to college to be and do after college?
So I was studying to be a teacher and a coach. So I love being around young people and coaching soccer. And so I studied education. I studied American history and education. I did my student teaching, so I got certified to teach.
High school or middle school?
I did middle school, 7th and 8th grade.
Okay.
And I mean, it was clear that I was going to do something else by the time I did my student teaching, but I wanted to finish it. And, you know, talk about humbling. Teaching is humbling. I think everybody should be forced to student teach.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter how many times you learn something, when you have to then stand up and explain it to someone else. Every night I'd brush up on the lesson for the next day and I'd think, I've learned this 50 times and I still don't know it well enough to teach it to somebody else. So it's a humbling experience.
That's awesome. So let's talk about sort of finishing college. You mentioned that you had already started thinking about doing different things sort of post-college other than teaching. What happened? What did you start thinking you would pursue? Obviously, you started this family foundation that, you guys raised a lot of money really quickly, and so that was a path that you could pursue. And how did you start thinking about that? How did everything start changing for you? And really at the end of your college term start coming into reality?
So there were a number of people who were really instrumental in terms of advice and guidance and help. There were some older Brown alumni who were just super supportive. And there's a quick interesting story. It's weird how Columbus sort of plays a role in this, but one of the most prominent Brown alumnus who had played soccer is a guy by the name of David Chichester, and he's an amazing human being. And at the time that we started the Ulman Cancer Fund, Dave Chichester was the CFO of Red Roof Inns, and he was living in Columbus, Ohio. And turns out he was also friends with Larry and Cindy Hilsheimer and all kinds of people in the community. And when we had the first several soccer classics of college soccer all-star games, the players all stayed at Red Roof Inn for free because Dave Chichester donated the rooms.
Oh, that's
so
funny.
It comes full circle. But Dave is an example of somebody who helped me think through like what the organization could turn into and how I could best lead it or support it. But the real turning point, I guess two of them. One was I applied for a fellowship from a place called Echoing Green. And Echoing Green is the preeminent organization in the country that funds social entrepreneurs. And that gave me a network of people to learn from, and it gave support to the organization for when I graduated from college. And so that was one transformational piece. And then the second was I got this outreach from Lance Armstrong and the opportunity to go work with him and the team that he had put together. And that also was transformational because it gave me this unbelievable career opportunity, but it also gave the Ulman Foundation an opportunity to develop and grow in ways that I probably would never have taken it. Mm-hmm. And Brock, who continues to lead that organization, has just done a remarkable job. And it's been the thing that I'm most proud of because I've watched him take it to places that I never could have imagined.
Yeah. So you went right to, at the time, the Lance Armstrong Foundation right out of school. Is that accurate? Or
I went there about 18 months after I graduated.
18 months after you graduated.
Yeah.
So were you focused on the Ulman Fund?
I was.
For those 18 months. Okay, got it. So you moved to Austin. Have you been to Austin before?
I had been to Austin once before.
In Austin once before. So you really didn't know what you were getting into?
Not only did I not know what I was getting into, I was living in San Francisco when I moved to Austin. I spent a few months in San Francisco living there. And the first week in Austin on the job, my colleagues, there were 3 colleagues at the time, they said, "Hey, we're going to go out tonight. Do you want to go with us?" I said, "Sure." So they said, "We're going to go to a famous place called the Broken Spoke, which is a 2-step sort of dance hall. But they also
still around today?
have food." Oh, yeah. It's actually a classic story where there's condos like all around it, but they preserved it in between. So it's like towered over by these, used to be like a dirt parking lot. Yeah. Now it's like these condos. So we get to the Broken Spoke and they say, "We're going to eat." Well, they didn't tell me how to dress to go to the Broken Spoke. So I show up in my Banana Republic shirt or whatever I had on, and we sit down to eat. and they said to me, you have to have the chicken fried steak, which I'd never heard of. And so the woman comes to take our order, and I said, I'll have the chicken fried steak, but I'll have the gravy on the side. And she looked at me and she said, you ain't from here, is you? And I'll never forget that. It was the last time I ate at the Broken Spoke.
Was it good? Was it a memorable meal? Or?
No, I remember the experience of the dancing and the scene, but yeah.
So you were one of the first 4 or 5 employees of the foundation. This was year-wise, 2000, 2001?
This was early 2001.
Early 2001. So, Lance's cycling career was sort of in full swing at that point, and then he had started the foundation. And then over really that decade, the aughts, the 2000s, Livestrong went from 1 employee to 5 to 50 to 100 to 125, and you got to really go along for the ride and ultimately lead the organization. What was that like, knowing your background as a survivor, as someone who deeply cared about the mission and the idea of survivorship, and being young and all of those different things that interplay into that? What was that like for you?
It was, it was a dream opportunity for a lot of reasons. You said the main one, which was just as a survivor to be around a community of survivors, mm-hmm. was powerful. And, the other reason it was a dream opportunity was that my role initially was not focused on fundraising. It was focused on how do you figure out the best ways to spend the money to help people. So develop programs that don't exist and look at where the gaps are. And, at that point, because of Lance's visibility and his stature, we could partner with anybody. We could collaborate with anybody. There were tons of opportunities coming our way. And it really bred this notion that anything's possible, because it was.
Yeah.
If you had an idea, we could go do it.
Yep.
And that's a fun atmosphere to work in. And so it was wild.
Yeah.
It was wild.
I think it's a famous story. It's been written about a little bit, but the story of sort of the wristbands coming to life, and I won't do it justice or preview it, but it wasn't the most popular idea, initially at the table. And describe that sort of being in the room, going through that process of, is this a good idea or not? Fast forward to it raised
a lot
of money.
Yeah, Nike was an incredible partner of the foundation, and when Lance was about to go to pursue his 6th Tour de France win, which would have set the record, okay, they said, we want to do something to commemorate this amazing feat should he win. And they said, we want to create this wristband, and we're going to make 5 million of them, and we're going to donate another $1 million. And if we sell all 5 million for $1, we'll have raised $6 million in honor of his 6th win. Like, that was the concept. And they said, we're going to put on this little yellow wristband, we're going to put Carpe Diem, because that was Lance's personal mantra that he talked about a lot and used for motivation. And at the time, in this was late 2003, early 2004, Nike had made 3 or 4 colored wristbands for NBA basketball players. And the NBA basketball players would snap them against their wrist when they were on defense to motivate themselves. It was like,
they made these for specific players?
Yeah, just for like certain teams in their color, And it was like the old thing when basketball players used to slap the floor with their hands to like get ready for defense.
Yeah.
They were called baller bands. And they were just about to start selling them. But nobody wore wristbands back then, and it wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
And so they said, we're going to take these baller bands, we're going to make a yellow one, we're going to put Carpe Diem on them, we're going to sell 5 million, give you $1 million, you're going to raise 6 million. We had 9 employees at the time at the foundation. And a lot of people, Nike's great at storytelling, and they're great at product development, obviously the best in the world. But we didn't know what we would do to help. We couldn't sell 5 million of them. We didn't have that reach, and we didn't, and they were just like, don't worry, we're going to help. We're going to take care of this. And so some people didn't think it was a good idea because they weren't sure they would sell. Others, myself included, weren't sure it was a good idea because I didn't think I would wear it myself. And so at the time I didn't wear a watch. It was just weird to think of wearing something every day. So it was just a foreign concept. And they went back to Oregon after presenting and they called us a few weeks later and they said, actually, we're on your website and we see that you have a program that you named Livestrong. And it was a resource center. It's called Livestrong, a resource for cancer survivors. And they said, what if we put Livestrong on the wristband? And so we liked that better, but we were still hesitant that they would sell 5 million of them, et cetera. And I never forget, somebody in the office in that meeting said, what are we going to do with the other 4.9 million that we don't sell? Like, it's a lot of waste. And so long story short, Nike said, if we put Livestrong on it, let us run with some ideas and come back to you. And they did. And it was just a series of events that nobody could have imagined. Maybe Nike imagined, but iconic moments where the yellow wristband kept appearing through their orchestration and some of ours that you literally couldn't ever have paid for. So the day they launched, at the time, Lance was dating Sheryl Crow. Sheryl Crow was on the Today Show playing the guitar and wearing one.
Yeah.
You then had the Tour de France where every rider wore one, no matter what team they were on. Every rider wore one.
Every rider in the Tour de France.
Almost. It was crazy to support this. You then had literally 2 weeks later the Olympic Games in Athens. And Nike put them in every athlete's bag that was a Nike athlete. So you had athletes that we didn't even know who were wearing them. Just this visibility of it kept growing. And then that fall, you had a presidential election. And you had John Kerry running against George Bush. And John Kerry was a cancer survivor, and George Bush had lost his sister to cancer at an early age. And every newspaper and every day, you saw these candidates waving with the yellow wristband on.
Yeah.
And it was like you couldn't pay for that visibility. So things just happened, and we sold out of 5 million really quickly, and the next 10 million and 20 million, and it just kept going, and it was wild.
Yeah. So,
but the story and I guess the piece that I should highlight, and the piece that I maybe didn't fully appreciate at the time, was that, and it's the same reason why Pelotonia has been so successful, is that people are craving an opportunity to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And for $1, you could wear a wristband and you could feel like you were a part of a community that cared about this cause, and you could share your story. And that has proven over time to be so powerful for so many.
Yeah, I think anyone who's worn, a Livestrong bracelet has had the instance where they saw someone else wearing it and asked, why are you wearing that?
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that I was probably, I remember wearing one sort of back in the day. It's, every Dick's Sporting Goods you would go into, they'd have bowls and, boxes full of them. And it almost normalized having cancer in a lot of ways because people, it was taboo to talk about before, and it became a front page of the New York Times.
Totally.
A presidential election, highlighting it, or the Olympics, whatever stage it was. And it gave people this freedom to say it was okay to share their story or, share why they cared. And that was ultimately, like, Livestrong was that platform for the world. It was
phenomenal. You bring up Dick's, which I'll just quick anecdote, but the chief marketing officer at Dick's at the time was a guy named Jeff Henyon. And Jeff had lost his father to cancer. And so he was totally bought in and embraced it. And really, Dick's was an amazing partner, not just for the wristband, but for clothing and shoes and everything. And Jeff is now a big Pelotonia rider and supporter and phenomenal person.
So I think the rise and fall of Lance is obviously well documented, and you had to lead the organization through, undoubtedly its hardest time ever, and that I think has gotten a lot of airtime over time as well. I'm curious, the one thing that you took from that experience of watching the organization and leading the organization to the highest of highs, to having to manage, on the way down, like, what were the things that stuck with you that you continue to think about to this day that made you a better leader, that made you, a better decision maker, more empathetic? What's that look like for you?
It's hard to pick one. I think maybe the most important lesson is that we're constantly having to make tons of decisions with imperfect information. And if you don't make decisions, you can become paralyzed. And especially in a crisis where things are out of your control and you're reacting constantly, but you still have to keep making decisions. And I think that's probably one. The second is you have to show tremendous humility when you don't know the answer. And I remember day after day getting questions from people internally in the organization, externally, and we didn't know the answer. And so you have to be okay with saying, we don't know, and we're going to try to figure it out. And then the third is probably that you have to, it sounds selfish, but you have to take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of yourself, you can't possibly lead anyone else. And so if you're stressed and tired and exhausted and lethargic, then you're not performing well. And so when you're in a stressful situation, it's hard to step out of that and say, I got to take care of myself, because it sounds selfish, but it's important.
Yeah. One of the things I always found fascinating about sort of you ultimately coming to lead Pelotonia is that you had been here before, and you'd been part of, negotiating contracts for Lance to come and participate in the first ride, and which is it makes things seem like such a small world. But I'm curious, as you came to that first event and then you watched Pelotonia from afar go from 4 million to 8 million to 12 million to 20 million, and I think really establish ourselves as an organization on the map in the cancer fundraising world, and what your perspective as a complete outsider was living in Texas, seeing this happen in Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah, I mean, being at the first one was pretty phenomenal. And in terms of, I remember Gordon Gee being so excited and being sort of off to the side of the stage. I was watching all the speakers and looking out at the crowd, and I'm not sure I fully understood that I was at Chemical Abstracts at the time. Like I knew I was at this beautiful lawn, but I didn't really know where I was. And there was just a feel. You could sense that people were energized and excited. And I didn't appreciate all of the nuances of the model at the time and why it had worked so well. But after watching it year 2, year 3, year 4, and keeping in touch with Tom and others, what was being built was truly incredible. And everyone in the country, not just in Austin, but everywhere, everyone was saying, how is this working? What are they doing? What's in the water up there? Like, how is this so successful? And so we were admiring it from afar. Yeah. And sort of in awe of what had been built.
Yep. And then fast forward a couple of years later, your phone rings or your email pings, and it's somebody from Columbus, sort of outreach, and they're looking for a new leader. And we had to have another podcast, which is the history of Pelotonia, and part of it is the recruitment of you. But I'm curious what it's like from your perspective of watching this organization grow and grow and grow, and seeing it from afar, and now all of a sudden the opportunity gets put in front of you to move your family up here. And
it was kind of surreal. I mean, I had gotten to know Mike Caligiuri, who was the CEO of the James for a long time, and he and I had worked together on a lot of projects. And I'll never forget, I landed in Austin, Texas on a Southwest Airlines airplane, and there was no Wi-Fi. And I landed, I turned my phone on, and there was a text from Mike, and he said, call me. And so as I got my bag down, I called him. I said, what's going on? And he said, do you have time for lunch sometime soon? And it was a Tuesday. And I said, sure. And he said, how about Friday? And I said, this Friday? And he said, yeah, I'll come to Austin. And so we had lunch on Friday. And it was Mike Caligiuri, Mike Eicher, and Cindy Hilsheimer. And they flew down to Austin, and we had a long lunch. And I went home, and I said to my wife, they asked me to consider moving to Columbus, Ohio. And she goes, oh, I didn't realize that was what the lunch was about. I said, I didn't either. But it was just interesting to hear them talk about the success and then also the community and why they thought it had been successful. At the time, I didn't know Steve Steinhauer. I didn't know about Huntington. I didn't know about the other corporate partners. I didn't appreciate that. All I saw was the fundraising number and the ride. And the more they talked about how engaged the community was, the more interesting it became. And it took a while to sort of think through, like, could I be helpful? Could I make an impact? What was the potential of the organization? And so I got to meet a lot of people and listen to them, and that was a great experience.
Yeah. So your first ride would have been 2015.
Correct.
Up here. So what do you remember about the 2015 ride? And obviously you were part of the planning and everything that leads up to that, but the ride's a pretty magical weekend, and sort of being in your position, curious what that first ride was like for you.
I remember realizing very quickly that the team at Pelotonia was phenomenal. And I remember realizing that clearly I was not hired to help with logistics or planning of a massive event, because they did such a great job of that already. And I just remember hearing from so many people during that weekend, people saying, thank you for organizing. Like, everybody was thanking me and the team, and which was great and felt good, but it was really a testament to the team and like how well organized things were and how well thought out and planned they were. So that was one. And then the main memory I have is from riding, and everybody talks about Granville and riding through Granville, and I remember that aspect of it, but also just the people I met along the way. And in particular, riding with Rob Hyatt and Jack Kukura, somewhere between Granville and Gambier, and ending up with these two guys who I didn't know, and listening to Rob tell the story of his wife, Mary, and her diagnosis and their relationship, Rob and Jack. And that's what I remember. I remember how hard the ride was, and I remember being exhausted, but I remember that story and that connection that lives to this day. And I just got to see Rob down in Seaside, Florida in March. And that's where he lives. And we were down there on vacation, and we got to go have ice cream and hang out with our family. And, that's all because we met on a random hill on some August hot summer day during a bike ride for cancer research. Mm-hmm. And that's why Pelotonia is successful, because people meet other people that have a common shared value or shared goal, and they develop relationships, and it makes them want to come back again because they want to be connected to those people. And that's so much bigger than a bike ride or a fundraiser.
Yep. When I think about sort of your upbringing, sort of in this planned community where, it was really wildly unique, and you didn't really realize it at the time. And then, sort of really instilling what community means to you. And then you go through this cancer experience in your early 20s. You get to be a part of, the growth of one of the largest cancer nonprofits ever. And you sit here today at Pelotonia, and we get to hear you say all the time, you've never been more excited for anything. Sort of when you think about what's in front of us over the next couple of years. And I'm curious, like, what is it that excites you? Where, what gets you out of bed every day to come here and continue putting energy into this? Because I think one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot, and we've had some conversations about it, and I think anyone that's been in this quote unquote line of business for long enough, it's hard, because you hear a lot of stories of diagnoses. You've lost more people to cancer than any person I know, and that wears on you over time, and it can also be really motivating too. And I'm curious, just where's your head at, and what is it that gives you that fuel and that excitement for where we're going?
Organizationally, what I would say is, this is our 13th year. And so in the scheme of growth, we're still pretty young. And yet we've had tremendous growth, and we've gone through some challenges, bumps in the road, pandemic and non-pandemic related. And we've made it through with unlimited opportunity in front of us, and now an incredible team and infrastructure to go seize these opportunities. So I think a lot of organizations, they rise and then they fall, or they rise and they sort of sputter, they sort of putter along. We have unlimited growth potential. That's why I'm excited, because we now have the right goals for our 5-year sort of horizon. We've got the right team, and now it's on us to execute. And so who wouldn't want that chance? I think personally, it is hard. I mean, I think about it a lot. People that are no longer here, and I feel in some ways a sense of responsibility to keep going. And I also feel like we have to constantly remember how fortunate we are to be here with the opportunity to literally save and change people's lives. Like, that's why I sometimes get frustrated, because it's like, if we don't take advantage of this opportunity, the world is not better off.
Right.
Like very few people can say that about their job. Like, if I don't do my job well, people might suffer. And if I do my job well, people might thrive.
Yep.
Like, that's the opportunity that we have. And, but it's hard. It's hard. I mean, I have this ritual. I think we've talked about this, but I save voicemails from people who've passed away, and I scroll through them all the time, and I scroll through my contacts all the time, and I see all these names of people who are no longer here. And I mean, we're fortunate to be here.
Yeah.
And if my friend Wendy could fly here in 2019, barely able to breathe, from halfway across the country to try to ride 35 miles, then we can do that extra step, that extra commitment, whatever it might be, on behalf of all the Wendys of the world who would love to be here to ride.
Yep. Beyond Pelotonia, and I think one of the things that's so interesting about you is you have a lot of interests. You have a lot of genuine interest in helping people, anyone that's worked closely with you. And I say this with a smile on my face, but it's true. You're never short on ideas, and some of those are amazing ideas, and some of those we've got to wrangle you in and tell you no. But you get your energy when you're at your best, when you're ideating and thinking about big things. You had a chance in your early 20s, and I think the echoing green thing is something you touched on really lightly, but an organization that has done some really powerful things and to fuel some really powerful movements. I think, as you look in the future, there's very few people that have had the experience you've had in terms of sort of being a social entrepreneur and building, some of the biggest movements that the community's seen. And how do you think about translating that and sort of giving that back to the next generation of people, the college student, today that's either going through something or wants to create a change in the world? And, where's your head at on how you can influence and impact that next generation?
You asked before about what I was going to do in my sort of career path, and I talked about wanting to be a teacher. I mean, part of it is that I just love being around the energy that young people have, whether it's high school, college, what have you, the entrepreneurial spirit, people who are naive enough to think they can go do something, and they're not confined by life. They're not, as people get older, they become more risk averse, right? Because of whatever factors in their life. And so I love spending time with people who have big ideas. And so I would love to help make those a reality by offering advice, support, resources, whatever it might be. And what I learned from Echoing Green is that there is a way that you can identify people who are most likely to be successful. And so their concept is find the people, give them the resources, and let them go do it, as opposed to a more traditional sort of grant making or organizational support. And so they're basically a venture capital firm for people who want to have an impact on society.
Yeah.
And so I love that because I learn from those people, and I always say I learn more than I could possibly give. But I constantly think about how could we invest in more social entrepreneurs who will ultimately create massive movements and change organizations. And I think we can do that in a more robust way, both in Columbus and beyond.
Mm-hmm. So we'll end with sort of this last question, and you're far away from your cancer experience, but you're still not that old. And but what would you tell 19-year-old Doug, about what sort of life had in front of him, and how do you think about that experience you've had in the last 20 or 25 years?
I feel incredibly fortunate to have had the experiences I've had in my life. I remember when I turned 30, I had a small dinner with friends, and I said, if the next 30 years of my life are half as good as the first 30,
then you're good.
It would be incredible.
Yeah.
And somebody said to me, but you had cancer 3 times in your first 30. Like, what do you mean? And I said, but it's been a blessing. Like, at the time, it was nowhere near that. But again, to have the opportunity to spend every day trying to help others is something that I don't take for granted. So what would I tell my 19-year-old self? I mean, I guess two things that were told to me. So one was Gordon Gee, who told me while I was in college, he said, my goal for you is that you never have a resume. And what he meant was, if you just focus on what you're doing and do it as well as you possibly can, you will get noticed and you will have more opportunities come your way. You'll never have to apply for something. And the second was my 5th grade teacher, who was very much a rebel and a renegade, and used to play rock and roll music in the classroom and let us read and just do sort of things that were not probably part of the curriculum. And at one seminal point in my life, he sent me a card and he enclosed a check. I can't remember if it was for $50 or $25 or whatever it was. But at the bottom of the card, he wrote, I hope you use this to buy some sunglasses because your future looks awfully bright. And I'll never forget that.
Yeah.
And just this week, I heard about one of our riders, longtime riders and captains, whose son was just diagnosed, and it currently is in his 5th week of 12 weeks of chemotherapy. And I sent him a card, and I included a pair of our Pelotonia branded sunglasses. And I said, your future's awfully bright.
Yeah.
And, it is. And he may not think it today, but in a couple of years, he'll look back and learn, or look and see that he's learned so much and matured so much at an early age because of the diagnosis, just as you have.
Yeah. Well, I love it. Well, I think on behalf of the whole community and obviously our team and myself, I mean, it's a pleasure to get to work with you and know you and be able to call you a friend. I think the entire community should be excited and really fired up that, you're continuing to lead this organization into the future. And we've got some really, really big goals ahead of us. But, as you shared with us earlier, like, you got to put those big goals out in the universe and march towards achieving them. And I'm looking forward to getting it done with you. So
it's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you. And it goes without saying, but we're just conduits, right? I mean, we have the opportunity to work here, but Pelotonia is about the community and the stories and the platform that they have developed, and we're just stewards in some ways. And so I'm continually inspired by your leadership and also by the community at large, and that's what's going to fuel us towards our audacious goals.